Dad, don't come tomorrow. You don't fit the hotel's image. Those words found me in my backyard, hammer in hand, patching the cedar fence I'd built with my son years ago. That hotel, the one he was set to open the very next evening, sat on my land. My signature was on the $8 million loan. Every permit traced back to me. And still my own son had decided I was an embarrassment not fit to walk through the door. No argument, no pleading. I went to my late wife's safe and opened it. 4 days later, his 37th missed call told me his world was coming undone. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. If these stories of family trust and hard-won dignity mean something to you, it would mean a great deal to me if you'd hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something about knowing a man is sitting with his morning coffee in one place while another is winding down his evening somewhere else, all of us carrying our own quiet stories. One more thing before I begin. Some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it, and that part is real. The phone buzzed again. I set the hammer down on the fence rail and fished it from my pocket. The screen showed a text from Dylan, my son, 38 years old, now CEO of Blue Ridge Crest Resort, the kind of man who fired off messages with the same cool efficiency as someone routing a shipment rather than reaching out to his father. The message read, "Dad, don't come tomorrow. Renee thinks you don't fit the hotel's image." I read it once, then twice, then a third time. The fence post I'd been driving stood only half sunk, the nailhead still proud of the wood. I slid the phone back into my pocket and lifted the hammer. 3 more strikes, clean, deliberate, and the nail sat flush. Then I went still. The resort. Tomorrow was the grand opening. I'd known it was coming for months. Dylan had mentioned it in passing during our last call in September. One of those offhand references that assumed I was already in the loop. No invitation had come, but I'd chalked that up to the chaos of event planning. Dylan was stretched thin. Renee handled all of that. I figured I'd simply show up, shake a few hands, stay well out of the way. Now I looked at the fence. It wasn't close to finished. Half the posts still needed replacing, and the horizontal rails had warped and sagged over the years. I'd built this fence with Dylan when he was 14, back when Saturdays meant working alongside me on projects rather than reviewing profit and loss statements. We'd measured every post together, leveled, every rail painted, the whole thing white because Nadine said it would look cleaner. Nadine had been gone 7 years now, dead at 62 from a cancer that moved faster than any of us could reckon with. Her safe still sat in the corner of my office, holding the documents she'd taught me to read like a logistics manual in a life I hadn't known I was running. I walked inside. My office was a small room off the kitchen, its shelves still lined with binders from my years at the helm of Colfax Freight. 35 years I'd spent building that company from a single truck to an 80-car fleet. I knew exactly what it meant when someone tried to move cargo without telling the owner. I opened Nadine's safe. The combination was her birthday, July 12, 1959. The door swung wide with the same smooth click it always had the day she first had it installed. When we began assembling the resort's paperwork, she'd insisted on order color-coded folders, alphabetical tabs, everything documented. I pulled the thick folder labeled Blue Ridge Crest Resort and carried it to my oak desk. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in 6 months. I laid them out in a row the way I used to organize freight manifests, left to right, chronological order, each page, one piece of a much larger picture. The 40-acre lakeside lease. My name as primary leaseholder signed 18 months ago. The personal loan guarantee, $8 million, my signature at the bottom right above the notary seal, dated April 2020. The Loudoun County building, permits responsible party Raymond Colfax, filed June 2020. The construction contracts, guarantor Raymond Colfax, August 2020. Every single document, my name, not Dylan's, mine. I settled slowly into the chair Nadine used to occupy when she went over our taxes. The old wooden seat groaned under me the same way it had always groaned under her. The documents lay spread before me like exhibits in a case I hadn't known I was assembling. Nadine used to say, "If your name is on the paperwork, you're not a guest. You're the one who decides who gets invited." I lifted the lease and read it again. 40 acres of prime lakeside property leased in my name for 30 years with automatic renewal clauses. The resort stood on that land. Every room, every conference hall, every manicured pathway, all of it resting on a lease that named me as the responsible party. The loan guarantee was worse. $8 million in personal liability. If the resort went under, the bank came after me, not Dylan, not his company. Me, my house, my savings, everything I'd spent 4 decades building. And yet tomorrow was the grand opening, the night Dylan and Renee had spent 8 months engineering, when investors and journalists and local politicians would tour the property, cut ribbons, give speeches about vision and legacy, and building something meant to endure. And my son had just sent me a text telling me to stay home because I didn't fit the image. I sat there in that office with every document fanned across the desk, each one bearing my name and not his, and I thought about that message still sitting in my pocket. This wasn't being left off a guest list. I was being erased from something I owned. I needed someone who would give me the truth without cushioning it. I found Claudette Fairweather's name in Nadine's address book at 9:30 that night, written in the careful accountant script my wife had used for everything that mattered. The leather-bound book had sat on the shelf above my desk for 40 years, organized alphabetically with tabs Nadine had cut from colored cardstock. Some entries were crossed out in black ink, the dead. Others had phone numbers updated in pencil, the living. Claudette's entry held 3 numbers, office, home, and a cell number added in Nadine's handwriting in 2013, the year before she got sick. I called the cell. She answered on the first ring. "This is Claudette." Her voice was exactly as I remembered from a decade back, direct, unrattled, the tone of someone who fully expected late-night calls and was always prepared for them. Claudette Fairweather was 64 now, a semi-retired commercial real estate attorney who'd worked contracts alongside Nadine 20 years ago when Colfax Freight was pushing into new routes. She'd reviewed every vendor agreement, every lease, every liability clause we put our names to. Nadine used to say, Claudette could read a contract the way I could read a freight manifest, seeing what wasn't there as clearly as what was. "Claudette, this is Raymond Colfax, Nadine's husband." "Raymond?" A pause. "It's been a long time. What's wrong?" No small talk. No, "how have you been?" Just the immediate assumption that something was wrong because people didn't call Claudette Fairweather at 9:45 on a Friday night to catch up. "I need to talk to you about some documents I signed for my son's resort project." "Tell me every document you signed," she said. "Every single one. Don't skip anything." I went through the list slowly, methodically, the way I used to inventory cargo shipments. The 40-acre lakeside lease with my name as primary leaseholder. The personal loan guarantee for $8 million. The Loudoun County building permits listing me as responsible party. The construction contracts naming me as guarantor. The vendor accounts carrying my signature. She didn't interrupt. Didn't ask clarifying questions. Just let me talk for what felt like 6 full minutes. Her silence on the other end of the line as steady as Nadine's used to be when I'd come in from work needing to talk through a problem before I could solve it. When I finished, she was quiet a moment longer. "Raymond, I need to see you in person tomorrow morning early. Can you be in Washington by 7:30? She right. "Yes. My office, same building as before. I'll have coffee ready." She hung up without a goodbye. Nadine had taught me to keep that address book current, cross out the dead. Update the living, never assume someone would still be there when you needed them. I returned the book to the shelf and went upstairs to bed. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, and a memory surfaced, sharp and fully formed the way memories do when you're too worn down to hold them back. Summer, 1997. Dylan was 14. We were building that very fence, the same cedar fence I'd been repairing when his text arrived that afternoon. The Virginia heat that summer was relentless, the kind that made the air feel thick enough to chew. We'd been at it since 7 in the morning, and by noon the temperature had climbed to 94 degrees. Dylan drove a nail into a fence post at an angle crooked enough that it would work loose within a year. I stopped him before he could finish driving it. "You do it right or you do it twice, son," I said. He looked at the nail, then at me, then pulled it out and tried again. This time it went in straight. He grinned, proud of himself, in that unguarded way kids have before life teaches them to mask their feelings. "Got it, Dad, watch this one." He drove the next nail perfectly on the first try. Nadine came out a few minutes later carrying 2 glasses of lemonade on a tray, condensation already beating down the sides. She stood in the shade of the oak tree she'd planted 2 years before, watching us work. "You two want something to drink?" she called out to us. 94 degrees out there, and Dylan jogged over and drained his glass in 3 long gulps. I drank mine slower, standing beside Nadine under that oak tree, both of us watching our son measure the next fence post with the level I'd shown him how to use. "He's learning," Nadine said almost to herself. He's a good kid, I said. She smiled. He's your kid. Memory works like that sometimes. The harder you fight for sleep, the sharper the image is cut until the past feels more present than the room you're lying in. I could smell the cut cedar from that afternoon 24 years back. I could hear Dylan's laugh when a nail went in straight. I could see Nadine's smile beneath that oak tree, still young, still healthy, 7 years from the cancer that would take her. You do it right or you do it twice. Dylan had absorbed that lesson. He'd absorbed it thoroughly enough to raise an entire resort to structure, contracts, negotiate loans, manage construction timelines from the ground up. Thoroughly enough to do everything right, except he'd done it by writing me out of the very project I'd financed. I finally drifted off sometime around midnight. When my eyes opened, it was 5 o'clock in the morning, Saturday, November 11th, the day of the grand opening. I brewed a pot of coffee in the dark and stood at the kitchen window looking out at that unfinished fence. 24 years ago, Dylan and I had knocked it out together in 3 days. Now it stood half-done rotted posts, still waiting rails, still sagging where the wood had gone soft. I poured the coffee into a travel mug and headed for my truck. I was driving to Washington to sit across from a lawyer I hadn't seen in a decade and find out exactly what my son had built on top of my name. Claudette was already at her desk when I walked in at 7:33, coffee cups lined up beside a stack of records she'd pulled overnight. The office hadn't shifted in 10 years, same oak furniture, same shelves of legal binders arranged by year and client, same framed Virginia Bar Association certificate on the wall behind her chair. The only differences were the laptop newer and thinner than before, and the gray threading through Claudette's hair, which had been brown the last time I'd sat across from her. She looked up as I came through the door. "I pulled the county records last night after we hung up," she said. "Sit down, Raymond." I handed her the Blue Ridge Crest folder and settled into the leather chair across from her desk. She opened the folder and began fanning the documents across the oak surface in deliberate order left to right, chronological, the same method I used to use laying out freight manifests at Colfax. Then she started reading. 20 minutes, not a word. I sat there working through the coffee she'd poured for me, black, no sugar, the way Nadine always made it, and watched her face for any reaction. There wasn't one. She moved through each page with the same neutral expression, penciling an occasional note in the margin before turning to the next sheet. With practiced efficiency, the lease, the guarantee, the permits, the construction contracts, every document I'd signed 18 months ago now spread under fluorescent office lights on a Saturday morning while my son, somewhere across the state, prepared to cut ribbons at a grand opening I'd been told not to attend. Claudette set the final page down squarely and looked up. "Dylan's LLC has zero collateral of its own," she said. "Every single asset backing this $8 million loan is yours personally, Raymond. Your land, your accounts, your name." I set my coffee cup down slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means if the resort misses its operating benchmarks or defaults on any payment schedule, the bank doesn't pursue Dylan's business assets. They don't go after his office equipment or his receivables or his future revenue. They come for you." She lifted one document from the stack, the loan guarantee, and placed it directly in front of me. Her finger rested on my signature at the bottom, the same pen stroke I recognized from 18 months ago when Dylan had sat at my kitchen table with these papers spread out asking for a little help getting started. "They seized the 40 acres first," Claudette continued, "then the savings accounts, then anything else carrying your name." I stared at the signature, my handwriting, my legal commitment, my exposure. "Dylan told me it was a formality," I said quietly. "He said the bank required a family member on the paperwork for the first 3 years just until the resort built up an operating history." "That's partially true," Claudette said. "Banks do require guarantors on new hospitality ventures, but the structure here isn't a formality. It's a full personal guarantee, no cap, no sunset clause, no co-guarantor. If this resort goes under, you lose everything." In 35 years of freight logistics, I'd learned that whoever's name sits on the bill of lading owns the cargo. Everyone else is just moving boxes. "How much risk are we talking about?" I asked. Claudette drew another document from the stack, a cash flow projection I had never seen. "According to the loan terms, the resort needs to maintain an operating margin of at least 12% by year 2 to avoid triggering the default provisions. If they miss that benchmark, the bank can call the full guarantee immediately. And if they hit the benchmark, then nothing happens. The loan continues. Dylan keeps running the resort, and you remain on the hook as guarantor until the loan is paid off or refinanced." "How long is the term?" 15 years. I sat back. 15 years. I'd be 84 years old when this guarantee finally expired, assuming the resort never missed a single benchmark, never defaulted on a single payment, never gave the bank any reason to go after collateral that bore my name instead of my son's. What about the lease? I asked. The 40 acres that's in my name too. Claudette nodded. You're the primary leaseholder. Dylan's LLC is listed as the operator, but the lease obligation runs through you. If the resort closes, you're still on the hook for the land payments. Nadine had been gone 7 years, but her accounts were still there, still holding her name, still carrying 30 years of careful patient work. And my son had put them at risk without breathing a word of it to me. Did Dylan know this? I asked. When he signed these documents, did he understand that I was absorbing all of the risk? Claudette held my gaze for a long moment. Raymond, your son is a businessman. He runs a resort. He negotiates contracts for a living. She paused. Yes, he knew. The coffee had gone cold. Beyond Claudette's office window, Washington was coming awake Saturday morning, traffic thickening in the street below, people heading to breakfast, starting their weekends. Ordinary life going on while I sat in a lawyer's office, learning that my son had built an empire on my financial grave. So what does that mean? I asked again. Claudette closed the folder and looked at me from across the desk. It means your son is running a resort on your land, funded by your guarantee, backed by your life savings and the accounts Nadine left behind. She paused. And you were just told not to come to the opening. She let that settle. The question isn't whether you have leverage, Raymond. You're not just a guest at this resort. You're the foundation it's built on. Every contract, every permit, every loan document, your name is the one the bank looks to when it wants its money. So the question is what you're going to do with that. Claudette picked up her phone without asking my permission and dialed the bank's loan department at 9:15 that morning. This is Claudette Fairweather, she said when someone answered, calling as legal counsel for Raymond Colfax regarding the Blue Ridge Crest Resort loan. She waited, tapping a pen against her desk calendar with the same unhurried rhythm I'd watched her use 20 years ago reviewing contracts for Colfax Freight. Whoever answered must have transferred her because she repeated her introduction a moment later, this time adding my loan account number from memory. Yes, I'm calling to verify the current guarantor structure, she said. Has there been any communication from Dylan Colfax or his LLC regarding modifications to the guarantee terms? A pause. Claudette's expression held steady, but the pen went still. When was that? She asked. I watched her write on a yellow legal pad. 3 months ago. And what reason did he give? She wrote again, father getting older. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Nola Kettner, the bank's senior loan officer who had handled the Blue Ridge Crest financing. I couldn't make out her exact words, but I could hear the careful precision in her tone, the sound of someone who understood that everything being said was on the record. Claudette thanked her and hung up. She looked across the desk at me. 3 months ago, Dylan called the bank asking about removing you as guarantor. He told them you were getting older and he wanted to protect you from the financial liability. I sat very still. What did the bank say? They refused. Dylan's LLC doesn't have sufficient credit history or collateral to carry the loan on its own. You're the only thing standing between this project and the bank saying no. She slid the legal pad across the desk so I could read what she'd written. The words looked worse in her handwriting than they had sounded spoken aloud. Raymond, that is a line you need to remember. She said, your son didn't just exclude you from the opening. He tried to remove you from the loan 3 months ago, and when the bank wouldn't allow it, he kept you on the documents while cutting you out of everything else. I stared through her office window at the Washington skyline. Saturday morning sunlight bouncing off glass towers, people moving along the sidewalks below. Ordinary life. What do? I asked. First, you talk to people who know Dylan better than I do, Claudette said. Find out whether this is a pattern or an isolated decision, then come back here Monday morning and we work through your options. I left her office at 10:30 and drove out of the city. I had known Harv Dunfield for 43 years. We'd started Colfax Freight together with 2 trucks and a handshake deal, and if Harv was telling me to watch my back, it wasn't paranoia talking. Harv Dunfield's farm sat on 120 acres of Virginia land directly bordering my 40-acre property. We'd bought the parcels within a year of each other back in the early 80s, when land was still cheap and the freight business was just beginning to pay real dividends. His farmhouse stood at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees older than either of us. He was out on his wooden porch when I pulled up at 2 that afternoon, 2 mugs of coffee already sitting on the railing. Figured you'd come by eventually, Harv said. He was 72 now, 3 years my senior, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending more time outside than in. He'd retired from Colfax Freight the same year I did, sold his shares for enough to live without worry, and spent the last decade raising cattle and watching the seasons turn from that porch. I climbed the steps and took one of the mugs. What do you know? I asked. Harv looked out across his fields, golden in the November light, the same color my backyard had been the afternoon Dylan's text arrived. 6 months back, Dylan came to see me, Harv said. Alone, no Renee, asked to buy my 120 acres, offered a fair price, but he said something that stuck with me. What did he say? He said, "Don't tell my dad, I want it to be a surprise for him." I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. He came alone, middle of a Tuesday afternoon, pulled up in that black SUV he drives, Harv continued. Walked me through his whole vision, expanding the resort footprint, connecting his property to yours, building some kind of hospitality corridor along the lake. Real polished pitch. But then he added that line about keeping it secret, said he wanted to surprise you at Christmas. Harv turned to look at me. I told him no. Not because the offer was bad, it was fair money, but something didn't sit right. A man doesn't surprise his father by purchasing land that borders his property without a conversation first. That's not how family operates. Did you tell him that? I told him I'd think about it. He said, take my time. Just don't mention it to you. Harv paused. I kept quiet because I trusted your boy Raymond. I figured maybe he knew something I didn't about how you two handled things between you. In logistics, you learn to read a map in reverse. Start from where the cargo needs to arrive, then trace every stop it made along the route. Dylan had been building his route for months, and I was only now beginning to see the destination. Harv, I said quietly, what am I looking at here? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at those fields. The way men our age go still when they're trying to find the honest words without drawing blood. Raymond Walt, he said, that boy is drawing a map around you before you can even see the roads. I drove back from Harv Dunfield's farm in complete silence, no radio, no windows down, just drove. Those 12 miles home felt longer than they ever had. The grand opening was 5 hours away, and I was beginning to understand that the text message hadn't been where this started. It was just the first moment Dylan stopped concealing it. That evening, I pulled the Blue Ridge Crest folder from Nadine's safe again. Not to review the documents this time, but to arrange them properly the way she'd taught me to organize anything that mattered. 6:30 p.m. The grand opening was starting in 30 minutes, and I was at my desk sorting paperwork the way I used to sort freight manifests, by date, by type, by importance. Methodical, controlled, the same way I'd worked through every problem for 35 years. I stacked the lease on top, then the guarantee beneath it, then the building permits, the construction contracts, the vendor accounts, every document carrying my signature, every page that made Dylan's resort legally possible arranged in the order they'd been executed. Beneath the final page, I found something I hadn't caught before. A small note card, 3 inches by 5 inches cream-colored cardstock written in Nadine's careful accountant script in blue ink. I lifted it and read it under the yellow lamplight. Ray, when numbers don't add up, check who's doing the math. She'd written this for me years ago. I couldn't pin down exactly when, but I recognized the context. We'd had an inventory discrepancy at Colfax Freight back when we were still running 40 trucks and managing shipments across 6 states. One of our warehouse supervisors had been skimming cargo small amounts over months, banking on no one noticing. Nadine caught it by running the numbers backward, checking who logged each shipment against who verified the delivery. This wasn't prophecy. It wasn't a message from beyond. It was practical counsel from a woman who'd spent 30 years in accounting and understood that numbers don't lie, but the people working them sometimes do. I set the card on the desk and looked at it. She'd been gone 7 years and she was still right. Nadine used to tell me that the hardest part of accounting wasn't locating the error. It was accepting that someone you trusted had put it there deliberately. I looked at the documents fanned across my desk. Every signature mine. Every risk mine. Every legal obligation mine. And I thought about Dylan's call to the bank 3 months ago. My father is getting older. The phrase Nola Kettner had quoted with such careful precision. When numbers don't add up, check who's doing the math. I closed the folder, set Nadine's note card on top, and walked out to my truck. I wasn't going inside. I just needed to see it. The drive to Blue Ridge Crest Resort took 12 minutes from my house. The same roads I'd traveled hundreds of times across the years. The same route I used to take when Dylan was young and we'd go fishing at Clater Lake together. Same landscape, different destination. I arrived at 7 p.m. exactly. The lot was full. Luxury cars lined the roads, sedans and SUVs with dealer plates still showing in rear windows. The kind of vehicles people drive when they want you to know they can afford something better. I counted at least 50 cars, maybe more, clustered near the entrance where amber light poured from massive glass windows. I parked in the far corner of the lot, 200 feet from the entrance, and cut my headlights. For 40 minutes, I sat there watching. Music drifted from the resort, faint polished, the kind of jazz quartet Dylan had probably brought in to make the right impression on investors. Shadows moved inside the glass-walled lobby. People in suits and cocktail dresses, waiters with trays, someone laughing too loudly, the sound carrying clean through the November air. My son was in there somewhere working the room, accepting congratulations, laying out his vision for the future of Virginia hospitality. And I was parked on my own land, staring at a building funded by my own guarantee, listening to laughter from people who had never heard my name and had no idea it sat at the bottom of every foundational document. 40 minutes parked 200 feet from a party I'd financed on land I owned, watching my son celebrate something built on top of my signature. The distance between that truck and that entrance might as well have been 40 miles. At 7:40, I turned the key, shifted into gear, and drove home. 12 miles back. Same roads, same landscape. I walked into my kitchen at 8:15 and stopped. There it was, a single sheet of paper lying alone on the counter, white against the dark wood. An email Dylan had printed out and left behind on his last visit, forgotten in the rush. I picked it up. The sender was a man named Harlan Okafor, writing to Dylan, timestamp 3 weeks back. Subject line, reacquisition discussion, Claytor Lake valuation. One sentence in and I had to stop. Dylan following up on our conversation about the $34 million acquisition value and timeline for removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. $34 million. That bore no resemblance to the $3.2 million in construction costs Dylan had cited when I put my name on the guarantee. It had nothing to do with the operating budget he'd laid out for me at this very kitchen table 18 months prior. $34 million and legacy assets. My fingers tightened around the counter's edge as I went back over the line. October 12th, 2021, the date stamp in the header. 1 month before the doors opened. That single email rewrote everything I thought I knew. I was still standing at that counter overhead light, buzzing the page, trembling in my grip, when I forced myself through it a second time to be certain my eyes hadn't deceived me. From Harlan Okafor to Dylan Colfax. Subject RE acquisition discussion, Claytor Lake valuation. Dylan following up on our conversation about the $34 million acquisition value and timeline for removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. Once we restructure the senior Colfax's name out of the primary documents, we can proceed with the valuation as discussed. Timeline still works for Q1 2024 close. Looking forward to finalizing terms next month. A third pass. Still $34 million. What Dylan had given me when we sat down to sign 18 months ago was a figure around $9 million. Construction furnishings, working capital, all of it bundled together. 9 million, maybe 10 if conditions stayed favorable. Not 34. And legacy asset. My own son had written those words about me in a business email, not my father. Not the man who signed his name so the bank would release the funds. A legacy asset, one that needed to be restructured out of the ownership structure before the deal could close. I flipped the page face up on the counter and stood there looking at it. Legacy asset. That phrase belongs on an equipment depreciation schedule. It's what you call a piece of machinery past its useful life inventory you need off the ledger before the auditors arrive. Q1 2024, 2 years out, give or take. Dylan wasn't managing a resort. He was positioning it for a sale, and my name on those documents was the obstacle because no serious buyer wants a 71-year-old guarantor attached to a $34 million transaction. I pulled out my phone and punched in Dylan's number. It rang 4 times and dropped to voicemail. You've reached Dylan Colfax. I'm unable to take your call right now, but if you leave a message. I ended the call, counted to 30, dialed again. 4 rings. Voicemail again. He was 12 miles away in that glass-walled lobby, champagne in hand, laying out his vision for people who had no idea my signature was underneath every document that made the place possible. Or he'd watched my name appear on his screen twice inside 2 minutes and made a deliberate choice that tonight was not the night to answer for any of it. I put the phone face down beside the email. The kitchen had gone very quiet, just the refrigerator's low hum and the wall clock Nadine had hung in 1985, still keeping time. 8:25 p.m. a Saturday, and I was alone at my counter, holding proof that my son had been engineering my removal from the very thing my name had underwritten. My mind went back 18 months. A Tuesday afternoon in April 2020, and Dylan pulled into the driveway unannounced. No warning call, just him at the door folder under his arm. That easy smile he'd carried over from Nadine, the one that had you halfway to yes before you'd even caught his first sentence. We settled at the kitchen table. He fanned the paperwork between us, lease agreements, loan applications, construction contracts, and for 45 minutes he walked me through his vision for Blue Ridge Crest Resort. The lighting scheme, the bar, the way Claytor Lake would fill the view through floor-to-ceiling glass. A destination that would put Virginia hospitality on the national radar. "Dad, I can see it all," he'd said. "I just need a little help getting it off the ground. A little help." A little help. That's the phrase my son used at this table 18 months ago. $8 million in personal guarantees. 40 acres Nadine and I had purchased back in 1983. My name on every document that carried legal weight. I signed everything he set in front of me, not out of ignorance about what I was accepting. 35 years running Colfax Freight had taught me exactly what a personal guarantee means. I understood what banks do when a project goes sideways and they need to recover what they're owed. I signed because he was my son, and he looked me in the eye and asked me to believe in him. So I did. I crossed to the cabinet above the sink and brought down the bottle of bourbon I kept for nights when the silence in this house pressed in too hard, poured a finger into a short glass, set it next to the email and the phone, left it there. My head needed to stay clear. The paper lay under the kitchen light, white against the dark wood of the counter. Every word I'd already read 3 times was still right there waiting. $34 million, legacy asset, Q1 2024, close. I'd been telling myself a story about why Dylan had kept me away from the opening, that I didn't project the right image for a property at that level. That Renee had looked at me in my flannel and work boots and decided I'd be an awkward presence. But that wasn't it. He'd kept me out because I had $8 million worth of skin in an asset he was planning to move for $34 million. And someone, maybe Dylan himself, maybe Harlan Okafor, maybe the two of them in agreement, needed me gone before I did the math, before I worked out that the man they'd labeled a legacy asset had helped build something worth 4 times the number they'd handed him. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, the email flat in front of me, the untouched bourbon to one side. 12 miles away, the grand opening was in full swing. Music carrying across the water, glasses being raised, my son working the room accepting credit from people who had no reason to think anyone else had made it possible. I needed to know how far this went, who else was in the room, and what they understood. I didn't move from that table for 2 hours. Just me, the email, and the arithmetic of betrayal. The bourbon never got touched. The wall clock pushed past 9, then 9:30, then 10. No radio, no second phone call. I sat and ran the numbers the way I used to reconcile freight manifests when the weight on the dock didn't match what the invoice said. $8 million guaranteed against a $9 million project. That's a tight margin, but it's not unreasonable. That's what a father does when his son needs a foothold. $8 million guaranteed against a $34 million project. That is an entirely different transaction. That is either a catastrophic failure of disclosure or a deliberate con. Dylan had an MBA from Georgetown University. He didn't misread a spreadsheet. He sat at this table again and again asking for my pen, all of it happening, while the true valuation sat in his files, and he handed me a number less than a third of the real figure. I turned to the lease. 40 acres of lakeside property, my land in my name, handed over to Dylan's LLC under a 30-year agreement. If the real number had been on the table, would I have accepted those same terms? Would I have put the same acreage at the same exposure? No. I'd have asked harder questions, drawn different lines, structured something that actually protected me. Dylan knew that, which is why the $34 million never came up and the $9 million figure was the one I signed under. Nadine used to say accounting wasn't really about the numbers. It was about who controlled which numbers got seen. Sitting there that night, I understood that Dylan had been controlling that for 18 months without a word to me. 12 miles away, the opening was still running. I belonged there, not as a courtesy invite, not as an afterthought. Dylan squeezed onto the list, but as the man whose name was the legal foundation the whole project rested on. Instead, I was at my kitchen table reading something my son had carelessly left behind, learning he had spent the past month working out how to cut me loose before the $34 million sale went through. Legacy asset. I looked at that phrase one more time and something cold moved through me and settled. What I had no way of knowing in that moment, what wouldn't reach me until 3 days later, was what Dylan was doing and saying about me right then. While I sat in my kitchen absorbing the $34 million lie, Dylan was across that glass-walled lobby at Blue Ridge Crest Resort, champagne in hand, moving through the crowd of VIP guests. Clifton Spurlock was somewhere in that room, a Washington, D.C. logistics executive with 15 years of contracts through Colfax Freight dating back to the days when I was personally routing freight across 6 states. Clifton knew me as one of the most dependable operators in Virginia, someone who got the job done on schedule every time, no excuses offered. Around 8:45 that night, Clifton made his way over to Dylan and posed the question every person in that room should have been asking. "Where's your father, Dylan? Word is he put up the land for this place." Dylan didn't flinch. "Dad's getting older," he said. He prefers to stay home these days. This is really a new generation thing. Clifton held his gaze for a beat, said nothing more, gave a slow nod, and moved on. From across the room, Daphne Beaumont had been watching the whole exchange. Daphne was 42, a Virginia business and hospitality reporter who'd spent 15 years covering the state's tourism sector. Renee had brought her to the opening specifically to produce a feature on the resort, the kind of promotional piece that runs in the Business Journal and gets picked up by travel magazines across the region. Daphne stood there, notepad in hand, watching Dylan's expression as he explained away his father's absence to a room full of investors who hadn't heard my name spoken once all evening. She wrote something down. If you've ever listened to someone you raise talk about you like you're a problem to be contained rather than a person they love, you know precisely what moved through me when I heard those words 3 days later. Getting older. Prefers to stay home. A new generation thing. I was 69 years old. I'd built Colfax Freight from a single truck into an 80-car fleet, sold it for enough to retire comfortably, and spent the 7 years since managing the accounts Nadine had left behind with the same careful precision she'd instilled in me. I wasn't senile. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't someone who needed to be handled or tucked out of sight while younger people stepped into the spotlight. I was the man who'd signed an $8 million personal guarantee so my son could build a resort on land I owned. And Dylan had just told a room full of people, including a man who'd known me for 15 years, that I was too old to show up at the opening of a project I had made possible. I didn't learn about the insult until Tuesday morning, 3 days after the opening, when Daphne Beaumont called me. She'd tracked down my number through the county land records where my name appeared as the primary leaseholder for the 40 acres right there in public documents available to anyone who looked. She called at 9 a.m., introduced herself professionally, mentioned she'd been at the opening Saturday night, and asked whether I had a few minutes to discuss the resort. Then she told me what Dylan had said. Word for word, Dad's getting older. He prefers to stay home these days. This is really a new generation thing. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, listening to a stranger read back my son's public dismissal of me. And in that moment, I understood exactly why Daphne had decided to write a different story than the one Renee had commissioned. She'd caught the lie. She'd checked the county records, and she'd found the gulf between what Dylan was telling investors and what the legal documents actually showed. The church was empty when I pushed through the door at 7 Sunday morning, just me and Pastor Alton Reardon settled in the front pew the way we'd sat 40 years earlier when Nadine and I first arrived in Leesburg. Alton was 70 years old now, 10 months my senior, with silver hair and the kind of worn hands that come from 4 decades of gripping the hands of congregants after Sunday services. He'd been pastor at Leesburg Community Church since 1982, before Nadine and I bought our house, before Dylan was born, before Colfax Freight had more than 2 trucks. He glanced up when I came in, but he didn't look surprised. Raymond, he said. I lowered myself onto the pew beside him. Early morning light fell through the stained glass on the east wall, reds, blues, and yellows laying patterns across the empty wooden benches. The church carried the scent of old hymnals and lemon polish. The same scent it had always held for as far back as I could recall. We sat together without speaking for a few minutes. Alton didn't ask what had brought me there. He didn't reach for prayers or scripture or words of comfort. He simply sat beside me the way he'd sat beside me 7 years ago when Nadine died, and 10 years before that when the freight business nearly buckled during the recession, and 20 years before that when Dylan was grinding through his divorce from his first wife. At last he spoke. What are you afraid of, Raymond? Not what had happened. Not what I needed. Not what God wanted me to do. What was I afraid of? I sat with that question a long while, watching the colored light drift across the floorboards as the sun climbed outside. I'm afraid that if I do nothing, I said slowly. I'm saying this is acceptable, that a son can lie to his father about millions of dollars, dismiss him publicly as too old to matter, and the father just accepts it because that's what family does. Alton nodded, but held his silence. And I'm afraid that if I do something, I went on, I become someone Nadine wouldn't recognize, someone who uses legal leverage against his own son, someone who turns family into a business transaction. Alton looked at me for a moment, then turned his eyes toward the altar at the front of the church, the same plain wooden cross that had stood there since the building went up in 1950. Then you already know what to do, he said quietly. You just need permission to do it. I looked at him. Permission. You came here this morning because you've already made your decision. You're just afraid it's the wrong one. You're afraid Nadine would be disappointed. You're afraid you're being vindictive instead of protective. He turned back to face me. But Nadine taught you how to read a balance sheet, didn't she? She taught you that numbers don't lie, and when someone hands you false numbers, they're not making a mistake. They're making a choice. Alton had known me since I was 31 years old and Nadine was 34, back when we'd just pulled into Leesburg with a baby and a single freight truck. He'd watched me build Colfax freight from nothing, bury my wife, shepherd my son through the years after Nadine was gone. And across all that time, he had never once told me what to do, only asked what I was afraid of, and let me work my own way to the answer. What would Nadine do? I asked. Nadine would check the math, Alton said simply. And if the math showed someone was lying to her, she'd make sure they understood she knew. Not out of spite, out of principle. He was right. Nadine had spent 30 years handling the books for Colfax Freight and a dozen other small businesses around Leesburg. She'd uncovered embezzlement twice, let a warehouse supervisor go for doctoring inventory numbers, and once took the stand in court against a vendor who'd been double billing us for deliveries. She hadn't done those things out of cruelty. She'd done them because allowing someone to take from you, whether the currency was money, land, or dignity, wasn't kindness. It was permission. Nadine used to say that permission was the strangest kind of gift. You can't ask for it without already knowing you need it. And once someone gives it to you, you realize you were the only one who could grant it in the first place. Dylan put my name on documents worth $34 million, I said. Then he lied to me about what they were worth, tried to remove me from the guarantee when the bank wouldn't allow it, and told people I was too old to attend the opening. Alton nodded slowly. And now you're asking whether defending what's yours makes you the villain of your own story. He paused. Does it no, Raymond? It makes you the man Nadine married, the one who knew when to build and when to protect what he'd built. We sat without words for another 10 minutes. The light through the stained glass shifted as the sun rose higher. Somewhere outside, a car door thudded shut and an engine turned over. I got to my feet. Thank you, Alton. He stood as well and placed a hand on my shoulder the same way he had at Nadine's funeral. You're not doing this to hurt him, Alton said. You're doing it to make sure he understands what he did. There's a difference. I nodded. I walked out of that church at 7:30 Sunday morning, drove the 12 miles home, and stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand. Claudette answered on the second ring. This is Claudette. Let's begin, I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't ask if I was sure. She'd been waiting on this call since Saturday morning when she'd spread those documents across her desk and laid out exactly what leverage I held. Monday morning, she said. 7:30 my office. Bring everything. I will. I hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the unfinished fence in my backyard. 24 years ago, Dylan and I had raised that fence together over 3 days. Now it stood half-finished, the old posts rotting where they'd been, the new ones plumb and solid where I'd set them Friday afternoon, just before his text arrived. Monday morning, I would finally see exactly what had been kept from me. Sunday afternoon, I opened the ledger and read the first entry aloud to Claudette over the phone, dated May 15th, 2020, 3 months after Dylan had asked me to sign the guarantee. Excluded from design meeting. Told decisions already made. The ledger was leather-bound, the same type I'd used for Colfax freight shipping manifests across 35 years. Black cover-lined pages, columns for dates, descriptions, and notes. Nadine had taught me the habit back when we were just getting the freight business off the ground and a client tried to claim we'd damaged a shipment we'd never laid a hand on. If it's not written down, it didn't happen, Ray, she'd said. Memory is just a story you tell yourself. Paper is evidence. So I started keeping records. Not right away, not the day Dylan asked me to sign, not even through the first month after construction broke ground. It was month 3 that changed things when I drove out to the site unannounced and found Dylan in a design meeting with his architect going over lobby plans. He looked up, and his face registered surprise as if I were an interruption rather than a stakeholder. I drove home and pulled out a fresh ledger. May 15th, 2020. Excluded from design meeting. Told decisions already made. From that day on, I logged everything. Every meeting I was never invited to. Every email chain where I'd been CC'd at the start, then quietly dropped from the follow-up threads. Every check I wrote toward construction costs that went unacknowledged. Every call Dylan let sit for 3 days, then 4, then a full week. 18 months of entries written in the same neat hand I'd used on freight manifests for decades. I wasn't sleeping, Claudette, I told her over the phone. I was building a case. She went quiet for a moment. How detailed are these entries? Dates, times, witnesses where applicable. I have the email threads, the voicemails he never answered, the checks bearing my signature that were cashed without so much as a word back. Raymond, this is exactly what we need. Can you bring it Monday morning? I'll bring everything. In freight logistics, you don't file an insurance claim on a damaged shipment until you've documented every mile it traveled, every pair of hands that touched it, every signature on every transfer form, because without that paper trail, you're just making noise. I'd learned that lesson 35 years ago, and I'd carried it here. People had probably looked at me and seen someone passive naive, too, trusting the old man who couldn't keep pace with his ambitious son's vision. But I wasn't passive. I was patient. There's a real distance between failing to notice what's happening and choosing to hold still until the full picture comes into focus before you move. I'd needed to know whether this was a single lapse or a deliberate pattern, carelessness or strategy, a busy son or a son who was methodically erasing me. Now I knew. I got off the phone with Claudette around 1:30 and went back to the ledger, marking the pages I'd photocopy before Monday's meeting. My phone rang again at 3 p.m. "Raymond, I found something," she said, skipping any greeting. "I've been combing through the Loudoun County Recorder's database for every document tied to your 40 acres. There's an amendment to the land use agreement filed 2 months ago, September 2021. It modifies the terms of your lease with Dillon's LLC." I lowered myself slowly into my desk chair. "What kind of modifications?" "That's what I need to verify. The document carries what appears to be your signature, but I want to confirm it's genuine before I tell you what it says. Some of these amendments are routine administrative updates. Others can fundamentally alter ownership rights." "Did I sign it?" "That's what I'm going to find out. I'm requesting the original filing documents from the county first thing tomorrow morning. I'll compare the signature against your other paperwork. If anything doesn't line up, we'll know." "How long will that take?" "Give me 48 hours. I want to be absolutely certain before I walk you through what this means." I looked at the calendar on the office wall. Sunday the 12th, Monday the 13th, Tuesday the 14th. 48 hours put us at Tuesday afternoon. "All right," I said. "Raymond, if that signature isn't yours, we're not talking about business ethics violations anymore. We're looking at potential forgery. That's a felony." Nadine used to say that patience and passivity looked identical from the outside, but the distinction was straightforward. Passive people wait for things to happen to them. Patient people wait until they have everything they need to make things happen. I'd waited 18 months. I could wait 48 more hours. "Do what you need to do," I told Claudette. "I'll be at your office Monday morning at 7:30 with the ledger. See you then." I hung up and sat at my desk a few minutes, the ledger open in front of me. 18 months of documentation, every exclusion, every dropped email thread, every unacknowledged contribution, and now possibly a forged signature on a document I'd never laid eyes on. I moved through the kitchen and stepped out into the backyard. The hammer was still resting on the porch steps where I'd set it down Friday afternoon 3 days ago when Dylan's text had come through telling me not to attend the opening. The fence stood half-finished, rotting old posts beside the new ones I'd already seated, horizontal rails sagging where the wood had warped over 24 years. I picked up the hammer. The handle was worn smooth from decades of work. The same hammer I'd used to build the original fence alongside Dylan when he was 14. The same hammer that had gone untouched for 3 days while I pieced together what my son had been concealing. I set a nail against the fence post and drove it home in 3 clean strikes. Then another. Then another. The fence wasn't going to finish itself, and I had 48 hours to wait before Claudette could tell me whether my signature on that amendment was real or manufactured. 48 hours before I'd know whether my son's betrayal had crossed from deception into felony. I kept hammering. Monday would bring answers I wasn't ready for. Claudette was still in the same clothes she'd had on Sunday when I walked into her office Monday morning at 8:30, coffee cups lined up on her desk beside a contract I'd never seen before. She looked up when I came through the door, and I could see she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that had begun working itself loose. The office carried the smell of stale coffee and long hours. "I've been pulling every clause in your loan document since yesterday afternoon," she said without preamble. "Sit down, Raymond. You need to see this." I took the leather chair across from her desk and set the ledger I'd brought on the armrest. Claudette slid the contract toward me, a thick commercial loan agreement with tabs marking different sections. Her finger rested on one page in particular, pressing against a block of text midway down. "Section 7.3, she said. "Change of control clause." I leaned forward and read. The language was dense, the kind of legal prose that stretches a simple idea into a paragraph of qualifications, but the meaning was plain enough once you cut through it. Any change in the ownership structure of the borrowing entity without the express written consent of the guarantor shall constitute an event of default entitling the lender to declare all outstanding principal and interest immediately due and payable. I read it twice. What does that mean in practice? I asked. It means if Dylan alters who owns the LLC without your explicit written permission, the bank can declare a default and demand the full loan balance, not in 15 years when the loan matures, within 30 days of the trigger. She pulled another document from the stack, the email I'd found on my kitchen counter from Harlan Okafor about the equity deal. Dylan is planning to sell 40% equity in the LLC to Halloran Capital Partners. That's Harlan Okafor's investment firm. That sale qualifies as a change in ownership structure under Section 7.3. And I haven't given written consent, I said slowly. Have you given any consent at all? Has Dylan raised this equity sale with you directly? No. Claudette nodded. Then the moment he signs that deal, he triggers this clause. The bank can call the entire loan, $8 million due immediately. I sat back in the chair. Dylan doesn't have $8 million. No, he doesn't, but you guaranteed the loan personally. When the bank demands payment and Dylan can't deliver, they don't go after his LLC's assets. They don't pursue his business. She held my gaze. They come for you. She drew out one more document, the personal guarantee I'd signed at my kitchen table with Dylan 18 months ago. Your 40 acres, your savings accounts, everything Nadine left behind in those trust accounts. The bank holds first claim on all of it the moment this clause triggers. What I was about to read in that ledger would show me just how long I had been standing in the dark and how deliberately someone had kept the lights off. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you suspected someone close to you was working against you in silence, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait, watch, and build your case first? In freight, we had a name for it, the deadweight clause. Fine print sunk so low in the document that no one finds it until after the damage is done, until the insurance adjuster flips to page 17, paragraph 4, subsection C, and reads the line that says you already agreed to swallow the loss. 35 years in logistics, and I'd watched that happen more times than I could count. Small operators who initialed vendor agreements without working through every page, then got handed a bill for losses they hadn't caused, and delays that were never their fault. I had always been the man who read every page. Until I wasn't. How soon is Dylan expecting to close the equity deal? I asked. Harlan's email put it at Q1 2024, first quarter of next year, under 3 months from now. And the moment he triggers that clause when the bank calls the loan, where does that leave the resort? Foreclosure. The bank takes the property, runs it through auction, recoups what it's owed. Dylan walks away with nothing. You lose every asset you put on that guarantee. And Halloran Capital collects whatever priority terms they locked in on the equity side. They'll be first in line to get paid before anyone else sees a dime. Claudette leaned back and pressed her fingers against her eyes. Raymond, nobody miscalculates their way into this. This is architecture, a deliberate structure, and every piece of it has your signature on it. I turned all of it over in my mind. Dylan's text from Friday, don't come tomorrow. Renee thinks you don't fit the hotel's image. The email about removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. Dylan in the resort lobby Saturday night telling Clifton Spurlock I was getting too old to leave the house. And now this clause, a tripwire rigged to go off the moment Dylan signed his deal with Halloran, positioned so every dollar of fallout landed on me while he walked into a transaction that valued the resort at $34 million instead of the $9 million he'd quoted me. Does Dylan actually know this clause is there? I asked. Claudette met my eyes across the desk. Raymond, he signed the contract. He initialed the LLC operating agreement that cross-references it. His own attorney would have walked him through what it means. He knows. 18 months ago, I'd put my name on that guarantee at my own kitchen table. Dylan beside me with his hand on my shoulder telling me, Dad, this is just a formality. I trusted him, so I didn't turn every page, which was exactly the error Nadine had spent 30 years warning me against. Read the whole thing, she'd say. Especially whatever they tell you not to bother with. Now I stared at Section 7.3 and understood that trust had been filed away and sharpened into something Dylan could use to take everything. So he knows, I said low and even. He knows that signing this deal trips the clause that the bank comes back for $8 million he can't cover, and that my land and Nadine's accounts are what's sitting in the crosshairs. Yes. Then what I need to figure out, I said, is whether he intends to pull that trigger or whether he simply stopped caring what happens to me when it goes off. Claudette let the silence sit for a beat. Either way, she said, we need to understand exactly how far down this goes. She found the court record Monday afternoon, a Virginia filing from 2015, 6 years old, lodged 3 years before Dylan ever crossed paths with Renee. She brought it up and angled the monitor toward me. The header read, Loudoun County Circuit Court Case Number 17-CV-8842. Plaintiff Bruce Whitmore. Defendant Dylan Colfax. LLC ownership dispute. Filed April 2015, Claudette said. Your son's first business partner took him to court. I leaned in and read. Whitmore had put capital into Dylan's first company, a boutique consulting firm. The complaint alleged that once the business started generating real money, Dylan had methodically cut Whitmore out of decisions, then maneuvered him out of his equity stake through a string of amendments Whitmore had never authorized or seen. The pattern was familiar, uncomfortably so. What was the outcome? I asked. Settled out of court 3 months after filing, records sealed under the settlement terms. I can't get to the figures. But cases that close that fast and that quietly usually mean one side paid the other enough to stop talking. Claudette shut the file. This wasn't Renee's influence, Raymond. Your son already knew this playbook before she ever entered the picture. I sat back staring at the blank screen. 2015. Dylan would have been 32, newly minted MBA, building his first real venture full of ambition. And he had already figured out how to freeze a trusting partner out of decisions, how to use amendment language to dissolve someone's stake, how to keep a lawsuit out of the papers. I'd known that business existed. Dylan had dropped it into conversation once or twice, said it hadn't panned out, said he'd come away with lessons about working with partners. He shaped it as a clean split, a difference of vision, nothing ugly. He never said lawsuit, never said restructuring, never said the man he'd parted from had accused him of the precise strategy I was living through now. 6 years I'd told myself Dylan had grown after that first failure, that it had made him better. All along it had only made him more precise, and the second time he'd chosen a target who trusted him too much to read the fine print. I need copies of everything, I said. Ready for you by tomorrow, Claudette said. I drove home from Washington, D.C., the same 12 miles I'd covered half a dozen times that week, and I worked at not dwelling on what it meant that my son had run this play before. Petra turned up at my house Tuesday afternoon. First time I'd laid eyes on her since the night of the opening, the first time Renee had let her come since Dylan's text shut me out. She came up the driveway at 2 p.m. at a run, Renee's car idling at the curb behind her with a bag of pears tucked under her arm. Grandpa, 8 years old, those quick, bright eyes, the same easy grin her father used to have. Mom said I could stop by while she's running errands. I pulled her in, and we took the front porch steps, sitting side by side in the November sun, working through the pears together. She talked the way she always did, schooled her teacher a friend who'd said something funny, a drawing she'd entered in a class competition and won a ribbon for. I kept up with her nodding when it called for a nod, asking the questions that kept her going. Then she handed me something I hadn't expected, and I stopped chewing. Grandpa Dad's office at the hotel has these really big maps on the wall, lines that go way past the lake. I kept my voice easy. Maps of what, sweetheart? I don't know, but they're huge. He and Uncle Garrett look at them every single week. I set my pear core down on the step. Who's Uncle Garrett? Dad's friend. Every Tuesday he shows up at the hotel and they go into the office and shut the door. They talk about where the lines go. She delivered it the way children hand over the most important things, flat plain, without any idea it mattered. That's the thing about kids. They haven't been taught yet which truths get kept behind closed doors. They don't know that some maps aren't supposed to reach a grandfather's eyes. What do the lines look like? I asked, careful to stay level. They go all around the hotel and then keep going way out past the water. Uncle Garrett points to different spots and Dad writes stuff down. I smiled at her, gave her hair a gentle ruffle. Sounds like quite an operation. You still doing drawing class? She was off on another story before I finished the sentence. I listened and nodded and asked my questions, and underneath all of it, something cold had taken hold in my chest. Dylan was pushing past the 40 acres. Every Tuesday, he was sitting down with a man I'd never once heard, mention the two of them tracing lines across territory I hadn't agreed to touch, land beyond Claytor Lake, beyond the resort's boundary, possibly beyond the property line itself. All of it happening in a sealed office while his 8-year-old watched without understanding what she was looking at. Petra finished her pear and raised her eyes to mine. Grandpa, are you going to visit the hotel sometime? I held her gaze. Those bright eyes that were so much her father's, the way he looked at that age before I understood what he was capable of. Someday, sweetheart, I said, someday. She wrapped her arms around me, then sprinted back to Renee's car when it pulled up to the curb. I watched them pull away, Petra waving through the rear window until the car rounded the corner and vanished. I sat on those porch steps for a full 20 minutes after she was gone, eyes fixed on the empty driveway, turning over the image of maps with lines stretching past Claytor Lake, past the 40 acres I held title to, past the fish pond Nadine and I had dug in 1996, the one Dylan and I used to fish at when he was about Petra's age, past everything I'd spent a lifetime building and guarding. I needed to put my own eyes on those maps. That Tuesday night I opened the ledger, but not to the pages where I'd recorded 18 months of exclusions. I turned to a blank sheet at the back, a clean page for something new. No more passive logging, no more watching to see what move Dylan made next. This was the page for charting a course laid out with the same methodical precision I'd used on freight shipping manifests. I uncapped the pen Nadine had given me 30 years ago, black rollerball Colfax freight etched along the barrel, and I started writing. Step 1. Confirm change of control clause timeline with Claudette. When is the equity deal set to close? Step 2. Audit all county recorder documents. Verify the amendment's authenticity. Cross-reference the signature against known samples. Step 3. Verify liquor license liability exposure. Confirm whether my name remains listed as designated responsible party. Step 4. Draft formal legal notices. Prepare written refusal of consent for any ownership restructuring. Step 5. Document every communication. Copy Claudette on everything. Build the paper trail. Each line short exact numbered the same format I'd relied on for 35 years when cargo went missing or delivery routes broke down. Nothing emotional, nothing vindictive, just a methodical accounting of what needed to happen set down in black ink. Nadine had spent 3 decades showing me that every problem had a manifest, a numbered record of what went wrong, who handled it, and what had to be corrected. The only distance between a salvageable situation and a total loss was whether you had the discipline to write it down before you started reacting. I'd absorbed that lesson back in the Colfax freight days when a warehouse supervisor had been quietly skimming inventory. Nadine didn't catch him by raising her voice. She built a spreadsheet that traced every discrepancy straight back to his shift rotation. When she finally sat him down, she didn't come in hot. She just laid the numbers in front of him and asked him to account for them. He couldn't. That was what I needed now. Not anger, not a confrontation, just figures that couldn't be argued away. I finished the checklist, shut the ledger, and picked up my phone. I sent Claudette a single text that night. She came back 30 seconds later, 8 a.m. Bring everything. I set the phone on the table and looked at that page, 5 numbered steps that would either defend what I had or confirm that my son had stepped past a line I couldn't walk back from. I spent the entire weekend finishing the fence. Saturday morning at 7, I headed out to the backyard with my toolbox and the stack of lumber I'd bought 3 weeks earlier. No calls to Dylan, no emails to Claudette. Just 2 days of driving nails straight and setting every board flush and level. The work was repetitive, methodical. Exactly what I needed. Measure the gap between posts. Cut the board to length, hold it level, drive 3 nails top, middle, bottom. Step to the next section. Repeat. Saturday carried over into Sunday. I stopped only for meals and sleep. Sunday morning I went to church the way I had for 40 years. Alton caught me on the front steps after the service, both of us standing in the November sun, my car keys already in my hand. "How are you holding up, Raymond?" he asked. I held his gaze for a second. "I'm finishing the fence," I said. Alton studied my face, then gave a single nod. He knew I wasn't talking about lumber. "Good," he said quietly. "Finish what you start." I drove home and went straight back to work. I'd started that fence with Dylan when he was 14. Showed him how to measure twice and cut once, how to sink a nail without splitting the grain, how to build something that would still be standing years later. Now I was closing it out alone, 24 years, on the day before I would turn every lesson I'd ever learned toward dismantling what he'd constructed on top of my name. Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, I drove the final nail. I stepped back and took in what I'd built. 48 feet of Virginia cedar, every board aligned, every nail sunk flush. The fence ran straight from the oak tree Nadine had planted in 1999 all the way to the corner post near the property line marking the boundary of the 40 acres we'd purchased in 1996. I dragged my palm along the top rail, checking for rough spots or anything that moved. Found none. It was solid built. Right, built to last exactly the way Nadine had taught me to build everything, whether that was a business, a reputation, or a line marking what belonged to me and what didn't. I went inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and looked at the calendar. Sunday, November 19th. Tomorrow was Monday, November 20th. Claudette was expecting me at 8 a.m. 10 days. In 10 days, I had uncovered what Dylan had been hiding from me. I'd put together 18 months of documented exclusions. I'd surfaced the court records proving he'd run this play before. I'd learned about the change of control clause that would wipe me out the instant he signed his equity deal. I'd heard from my granddaughter about secret maps and weekly meetings with someone named Garrett, and I'd finished the fence. Tomorrow was Monday, November 20th. Claudette was expecting me at 8 a.m. It was time to find out exactly what my son had signed without telling me. Claudette was on her feet when I walked into her office that Monday morning at 8 o'clock. She never stood to greet me, which told me that whatever she had to show me was serious enough that staying seated felt wrong. No good morning, no question about my weekend. She just pointed to the single document resting on the desk between us. "I need you to look at this," she said. I sat down and drew the document toward me. Amendment to Land Use Agreement, Virginia County Recorder stamp in the upper right corner, filed September 20th, 2021, 2 months before the grand opening, 2 months before Dylan's text told me I didn't belong there. And at the bottom of the page in blue ink, a signature, Raymond Colfax. I stared at it. "Did you sign this, Raymond?" Claudette asked. I lifted the document and examined the handwriting. Someone had studied my signature. The loops were close, the spacing was nearly right. But the slant was off too vertical and the pressure was wrong, bearing down harder on the downstrokes than I ever did. I set it back down. "No," I said quietly, that's not my signature." Claudette's expression went flat and hard. "That's what I thought. This is document forgery, Raymond. This is a felony." I read through the amendment carefully. It modified the land use classifications on my 40 acres rezoning sections from agricultural to commercial development, widening the allowable building footprint, stripping out restrictions on multi-phase construction. All of it clearing the path for Dylan's expansion plans, the ones Petra had described, the lines on those maps running well past the lake, and someone had written my name at the bottom to authorize it without my knowledge and without my consent. "Who filed this?" I asked. According to the county recorder, it came in by mail with a notarized signature verification. I'm pulling the original notary records now to find out who witnessed the signing. We'll know more once I receive the notary certification, but Raymond, what we're dealing with here is no longer a contract disagreement. This isn't your son making reckless business decisions. Someone used your name to commit a crime. Forgery isn't something you settle in mediation. It's not a family grievance you hash out at the dinner table. It's a felony prison time, destroyed professional licenses, the kind of mark that follows a person for the rest of their life. I thought about Dylan at my kitchen table 18 months ago, hand on my shoulder. "Dad, this is just a formality." I thought about the 2015 court docket and the business partner he'd squeezed out. I thought about Petra mentioning Uncle Garrett and the maps covering Dylan's office wall. And now this. A forged signature on a legal document remaking how my own land could be used, filed 2 months before Dylan told me I didn't fit the hotel's image. "What do we do?" I asked. Claudette pulled out another folder. "We document everything. We secure the notary records. We build the case. Then you decide whether you take this to law enforcement or hold it as leverage." She paused. "But Raymond, if you don't report it and the forgery surfaces another way, you could find yourself implicated. This has to be handled carefully." I nodded slowly. "How long until you have the notary records?" "End of the week." I filed a priority request. "Then we wait," I said. I left Claudette's office at 9:30 and drove back to Leesburg. I spent the rest of Monday at my office desk organizing documents and adding notes to the ledger. Tuesday morning at 10:30, a knock landed on my front door. Through the window, I could see a black BMW sitting in my gravel driveway, completely wrong against my 2006 Ram 1500. A man stood on the porch in a tailored Washington, D.C. suit and polished leather shoes. I opened the door. "Mr. Colfax," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Harlan Okafor, Dylan's strategic partner at Halloran Capital. I'd like to walk you through the full resort opportunity." I studied him for 3 full seconds. His face, his expensive suit, his rehearsed smile. Then I opened the door wide and headed to the kitchen without a word. I heard him step inside. Heard the door close. I didn't invite him to sit. Just went straight to the kitchen and started a full pot of coffee, leaving him to stand alone in my living room. I'd learned in freight that the strongest position in any negotiation is when the other driver doesn't know you've already reviewed the bill of lading, doesn't know you've tallied every damaged crate, doesn't know you hold every receipt that establishes exactly who's on the hook. Harlan Okafor had just walked into my house carrying a version of events I'd already disproved. While the coffee brewed, I let him take in the room. Simple wooden furniture Nadine and I had bought back in 1983. Her wedding photo on the mantel. Framed pictures from Colfax Freight's opening day in 1980. Me beside a single truck, 31 years old, building something from nothing. The manual wall calendar still flipped to November, the kind you turn by hand instead of checking a screen. This was the house where I'd raised Dylan on a freight driver's income, where Nadine had done the books at the kitchen table every Sunday night, where we taught our son that you build things slowly, honestly, by doing the work yourself, rather than maneuvering other people out of what they'd earned. The coffee finished. I filled 2 mugs, carried them back to the living room, and set one down in front of Harlan with deliberate calm, the ceramic touching the wood with a soft, definite thud. I settled into the chair across from him and said one word. Talk. Harlan drew a crisp manila folder from his monogrammed leather briefcase. The zipper made a smooth, metallic sound as he opened it, breaking the silence of my living room with the unhurried ease of someone who had closed hundreds of deals at this level. He spread 3 documents across my worn oak coffee table, pressing the edges flat with his palm and squaring them so they faced me precisely, the whole presentation calibrated to project authority. He started with the first page, a layered organizational chart, a clean maze of boxes and connecting lines representing corporate entities I had never encountered. Halloran Capital Partners anchored the top. Directly below it, joined by a heavy vertical line, sat Blue Ridge Hospitality Management. 3 separate subsidiary LLCs branched downward from there like roots wrapping around something that used to feel entirely mine. We've deliberately structured this acquisition to maximize operational efficiency while honoring the property's distinctive character, Harlan said, his manicured finger tracing the lines between boxes. Halloran currently owns and operates 17 premier properties across the Southeast: boutique luxury resorts, conference centers, experiential venues. Blue Ridge Crest fits our regional portfolio almost seamlessly. He moved at a brisk, confident clip, his enthusiasm carrying a surface warmth less like a deal maker than an art appraiser describing something rare. He outlined their plan to rebrand the resort under a broader hospitality umbrella, detailed an aggressive capital improvement program, new HVAC systems, expanded conference facilities to attract corporate bookings, upgraded guest amenities to support a significant jump in room rates. I watched his hands travel across the pages. I noted how the silver cufflinks caught the afternoon light. I listened to the practiced rise and fall of his delivery, a rhythm refined over years of settling nervous sellers. I sat without moving, waiting for the number I had already seen in the intercepted email to surface in his pitch. The real elegance of this structure, Harlan continued, pulling the second document forward with a broader smile, is that it lets Dylan keep full day-to-day control on the ground, while Halloran brings the capital infrastructure, financial depth, and brand platform. He stays on as managing director indefinitely. We absorb the back-end accounting, marketing, corporate strategy. He looked up and aimed a warm expression my way, certain he was laying something extraordinary in front of an old man. Frankly, it's the ideal arrangement for a legacy property of this caliber. What is the actual valuation? I asked, cutting straight through the narrative. Harlan blinked twice. His rhythm stuttered. He shifted on the sofa and adjusted his tie. The current independent appraisal, based on comparable regional properties and conservative projected revenue, puts Blue Ridge Crest at... He glanced at the third document as though confirming a figure he already had memorized. We're working from a $34 million baseline acquisition value. And that's conservative, frankly. Once Phase 2 expansion is complete and the digital booking systems are fully optimized, we're projecting... He kept talking. His mouth kept moving through a stream of corporate phrasing, but my mind had already stopped taking new information in. $34 million, said aloud, in the quiet of my own living room, not buried in an encrypted email I'd come across by accident, not hidden inside stacks of corporate correspondence. Spoken directly to my face by the man Dylan had personally chosen to structure this entire arrangement. $34 million. Dylan had looked me in the eye and told me the project was worth around $9 million, maybe $10 million if the regional market held steady. That was the figure he'd offered when I signed the personal guarantee, when I put my name on the commercial lease, when I handed him legal access to the 40 acres of timberland Nadine and I had purchased together in 1996. $9 million. Now Harlan was sitting in my living room drinking my coffee and calling it 34. I didn't cut him off. I didn't surface the discrepancy. I sat there in silence and let the confirmation settle while he moved on to earn-out structures, performance benchmarks, and revenue-sharing mechanics. Outside the window, a garbage truck backed down the street, its warning beep punching through the quiet at steady intervals. I watched a sanitation worker pitch heavy black bags into the compactor with blunt, repetitive force, while Harlan inside described Halloran Capital's deep commitment to preserving the resort's irreplaceable legacy. The truck moved on. Its engine faded. Harlan didn't miss a step. He stayed exactly 45 minutes. When he finally gathered his documents, slid them back into the briefcase, and rose to leave, he gripped my hand with that same steady, polished confidence. "I know that's a great deal to absorb, Mr. Colfax. Dylan speaks of you with tremendous respect, and I want you to understand Halloran doesn't erase what families build. We're here to help it grow." I nodded slowly. I said nothing. I walked him to the front door and stood on the porch watching the black BMW pull smoothly out of my gravel driveway and kick up a trail of dust. The moment his car cleared the gate, I had my phone out and was dialing Claudette. She picked up on the first ring. "Claudette, when did Dylan first meet with Halloran Capital?" I asked. No greeting, no context. The line went quiet, a long, careful silence. "Why are you asking me that right now?" "Because I need to know exactly when this started." Another pause, longer, heavier. "I'll need to pull the secure records," she said, her professional caution taking over. "Claudette." I put every bit of authority I had left into her name. "April," she said quietly, her voice dropping. "April 2021. That's when the first contact occurred based on the email trail. I'd pulled the county filings the night before. When I sat down hard at my kitchen table, my knees went soft beneath me. April 2021. 7 months back, a full 2 months before anyone had breathed a word to me about an outside investor being tied to the expansion. 2 months before Dylan had mentioned a single syllable about restructuring equity or bringing in outside capital. April. I had been out at the resort working beside him that very month. I had helped Dylan sort out a serious plumbing problem in one of the luxury suites, ruining a good pair of boots in the process. I had stood right next to him in the unfinished lobby while he laid out his grand vision for opening night with real passion in his voice. I had shaken his hand and meant it when he thanked me, eyes wet, for never stopping to believe in him. And the entire time he had already been quietly negotiating with Halloran Capital Partners behind my back, already talking acquisition values, mapping out earn-out structures, working out how to position the deal so I'd be cut out entirely. All while asking for my casual opinion on which ceramic tiles to use in the bathrooms. "Raymond, are you all right?" Claudette asked, her voice tight with something close to alarm. I looked out the kitchen window at the perimeter fence I'd just finished building with my own hands. 48 feet of Virginia cedar standing perfectly straight and level completed the very same weekend I had stopped waiting for answers and started moving. "I'm fine," I said, my voice gone flat. "What did Harlan tell you?" "He told me the resort is valued at $34 million. Claudette didn't answer right away, the sheer scale of the fraud settling between us like weight in the air. "And Dylan told you 9, she said at last, putting words to the depth of the lie. "Yes. Raymond, I need you to write down everything Harlan said in that meeting. Do it right now while it's still fresh. Exact figures, exact phrasing, his exact manner. If this ends up in a courtroom, we will need every piece of contemporaneous evidence we can get." "I will," I said, cutting her off gently. "But first I need to know what else my son has been keeping from me." I set the phone down without waiting for a response and opened my laptop on the wooden table. If Dylan had been running secret high-level negotiations with corporate investors since April, meeting with them privately, structuring complex deals, planning major expansions, all while performing the role of a son who valued my partnership emotionally and financially. What else had he done in the dark during those long months? What other legal documents had he forged or filed? What other binding agreements had he put his name to on my behalf? What other corporate arrangements had he made on land that still carried my family name? With a steady hand, I typed Dylan's full legal name into the official Virginia County Property Records database and clicked search. Claudette slid the Virginia ABC records across her desk without a word. I'd made the drive to Washington, D.C. on Wednesday morning after spending Tuesday night combing property records on my laptop. Nothing new had turned up in the county database, just the forged amendment we already had. But Claudette had called at 7 a.m. with a different lead, one she wanted to put in front of me in person. Now I sat in her Washington law office looking at a document I had never laid eyes on before. Virginia Alcoholic Beverage Commission, retail liquor license application for Blue Ridge Crest Resort, filed June 2020, approved August 2020, and there under designated responsible party, my name, Raymond Colfax. I read it through twice to be certain I wasn't misreading it. "What does this mean?" I asked. Claudette leaned back. "It means Dylan needed someone with clean personal credit and no corporate entanglements to be listed as the responsible party on the liquor license. So he used you without telling you." "Without telling me." I set the document down on her desk. "Walk me through what designated responsible party actually means." Under Virginia law, the designated responsible party is personally liable for any ABC violations at that establishment. If the resort overserves a patron who causes an accident, if they serve a minor, if they breach any state liquor regulation, the ABC comes after you personally, not the business. You can face fines, criminal charges, license suspensions. She slid out another page, the relevant ABC statute marked up in yellow. Your name has been on this license since August 2020, 16 months. Every day the resort has been open, you have been the one legally on the hook for every drink they've poured. I thought back to the grand opening, the champagne toast, the open bar Dylan had promoted in his marketing materials. All of it running under a license with my name on it, making me personally liable for anything that went sideways. Did Dylan forge my signature on this application as well? I asked. Claudette shook her head. No, this one appears to carry your actual signature. I compared it against the samples you gave me. It's genuine. I tried to place it. June 2020, 18 months back. Dylan had brought me a stack of papers one afternoon, told me they were routine licensing paperwork for the resort. I'd signed them without reading every page because he was my son, and I trusted him to flag anything that mattered. The same mistake I'd made on the loan guarantee, the same mistake I'd made with the lease, the same mistake I'd been repeating for 18 months while Dylan methodically loaded my name onto every risk and quietly lifted it off every benefit. He's working to remove your name from every financial gain, Claudette said, her voice low, but he's put your name on every legal liability. The loan guarantee, the liquor license, the forged amendment, anything that can go wrong falls on you. Everything that goes right belongs to him. I thanked Claudette, drove home, and did not call my son. Thanksgiving came the next morning. I was up Thursday at 6 o'clock, same as every Thanksgiving for 40 years. Made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, watching November fog move in across the 40 acres. The year before, Dylan and Renee had come for dinner. We'd gathered at this same table, me, Dylan, Renee, easy conversation about how the resort was coming along, about the school year, about what the holidays would look like. Renee had brought a pie. Dylan had helped me carve the turkey. That had been last year. This year I cooked for one. Small turkey, roasted potatoes, cornbread, the same meal Nadine used to make, scaled down to a single plate. I set the table at noon, one place setting water glass, the cloth napkin Nadine had embroidered in 1986, and took my usual chair. I looked at the empty seat across from me, the one that had been Nadine's for 34 years. After she passed, Dylan sometimes took that chair when he visited, and before that, growing up, it was where he'd sat for every family dinner from age 5 until he left home at 22. Now it sat empty. I ate in complete silence. No television, no radio, just the scrape of my fork on the plate and the wall clock above the sink measuring out the time. When I was done, I cleared the dishes, washed them by hand, dried them, put them away, wiped the counter, folded the dish towel. Then I went to my office and opened the ledger. I turned past 18 months of documentation, every meeting I'd been shut out of, every email that hadn't come to me, every contribution that went unacknowledged, past the strategic checklist I'd drafted 2 weeks earlier to a clean page at the back. I wrote the date, November 23rd, 2021. The weather cloudy, 48 degrees. Then a single phrase decided. Monday. The ledger entry took 6 seconds to write. The decision had taken 6 months. I closed the ledger and sat at my desk a while looking at the wall calendar. Thursday the 23rd, Friday the 24th, Saturday, Sunday, then Monday, November 27th. 4 days. I had spent 10 days uncovering what Dylan had buried. I had documented 18 months of deliberate exclusion. I had confirmed the $34 million lie. I had turned up the forged amendment. I had learned about the liquor license that bound my name to criminal liability while Dylan collected every dollar of the upside. And I had decided. I picked up my phone at 9:47 that night and called Claudette. She answered on the second ring. Raymond, is everything all right? I looked out the office window at the fence I'd finished 2 weeks before, standing straight and solid in the dark. Monday, I said. We send everything. Claudette's email landed at 6:32 Friday morning with the subject line, FW, confidential Colfax background verification. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when my phone buzzed. I opened the email and read the first line. Raymond Harlan Okafor made a mistake this morning. You need to see this immediately. Attached was a forwarded email chain. I clicked the attachment and read from the top. From Harlan Okafor to Sylvie Okafor, Halloran Capital Partners Legal Counsel, CC Claudette Fairweather, sent at 9:17 a.m. the day before Thursday Thanksgiving while I had been sitting alone at my kitchen table making up my mind to act. The email was short. Sylvie attaching background verification docs on our Colfax per your request. Financial profile confirms manageable risk level for Phase 2 structuring. Family records provided by D. Colfax show clean credit, stable asset base, no litigation history. Recommend proceeding as discussed. And beneath that, a PDF attachment. I downloaded it, opened it, and found myself staring at my own financial statement, the one I had submitted in confidence to the bank 18 months earlier when I signed the loan guarantee. Every detail laid bare, every account, assets, debts, credit history, the savings accounts Nadine had left behind when she died. The Colfax freight sale proceeds. The value of my house, the 40 acres, all of it assembled into a tidy 7-page document that Dylan had lifted from family records and handed to Harlan Okafor like a dossier on a business adversary rather than a summary of his own father's finances. I made the drive to Washington, D.C. Claudette was waiting when I walked into her office at 8:30. Harlan sent this to me by accident, she said, skipping any greeting. He meant it only for Halloran's legal team, copied me in by mistake. She pushed a printed copy across the desk. I picked it up and went through the pages. There were Nadine's account numbers, the ones she'd opened in 1993, still carrying her name 7 years after she was gone. There was the loan guarantee I'd signed in April 2020, believing I was giving my son a foundation to build on. Dylan handed your late wife's financial records to an investor, Claudette said quietly, to establish that you weren't a litigation risk. I set the printout down. He needed to show Halloran Capital Partners I wouldn't push back, I said. That I was manageable. Yes. I folded the printout and left it on Claudette's desk without speaking for a long stretch. Nadine had spent 30 years guarding our financial privacy. She had taught me never to share account information without necessity, never to give anyone access to records they had no real reason to see. She'd kept immaculate files, organized everything into color-coded folders, locked it all in the safe that still sat in my office. And Dylan had gone into those records, pulled documents from family files, scanned them and handed them to an investor, no permission asked, no word to me, using my dead wife's financial history as proof that I could be safely sidelined from decisions about a business I had made legally possible. Claudette drew another document from her folder. There's something else, she said. The notary certification records came back from the county. She laid it in front of me. The notary who authorized your signature on the forged amendment is named Wanda Picot. I ran her name through the corporate filing database. She set 3 more documents beside the first. She's notarized 3 other corporate filings for Dylan's LLC since 2019. Business formation documents, operating agreement amendments, contract certifications. I studied the dates: June 2019, March 2020, August 2020. This isn't Renee acting on her own. Claudette said the notary connection ran straight back to Dylan's office. Wanda Picot is someone he's used repeatedly for corporate filings, and she's the same person who notarized a signature that isn't yours, on a document that stripped your land use rights without your knowledge or consent. She leaned forward. Raymond, if this reaches the DA, your son is facing felony charges. Document forgery, notary fraud. These aren't civil disputes, these are crimes. I leaned back and looked at the documents fanned across Claudette's desk. The misdirected email showing Dylan had shared my private financial records. The notary certification tying the forged amendment directly to Dylan's corporate attorney. The liquor license with my name carrying criminal liability. The change of control clause that would bury me the instant Dylan closed his equity deal. 18 months of documented exclusion in my ledger. The $34 million valuation he'd concealed while feeding me a $9 million number. This stopped being about money a while ago, I said quietly. Claudette nodded. How do you go to the police when your son is the one who committed the crime and you still remember the afternoon you taught him to write his name? When you can picture the 2 of you at the kitchen table, him working through homework while you sat beside him the day you walked him through signing his first checking account card, watching him cross that stage at graduation. How do you hand over evidence that could put him in a cell when you're the man who raised him, who laid down right from wrong for him, who trusted that it had taken root? Claudette settled back in her chair and put the question we'd both been circling into words. If we don't go to the police, what options do we have? I looked at the email printout, the notary records, the liquor license bearing my name, the full architecture of systematic deception and criminal exposure Dylan had constructed while I trusted him completely. We use it, I said. Right time, right way. Petra ran across my backyard on Saturday morning holding a crayon drawing above her head like a victory flag. "Grandpa, look what I made." I was cleaning the fish pond filter, a task I'd done every November for 25 years, when she came around the oak tree jacket hanging open in spite of the cold. Dylan and Daphne must have dropped her off early. "What have you got there, sweetheart?" She thrust the paper toward me out of breath. The drawing showed a blocky brown building with blue windows. Stick figures stood out front. Behind the building she'd drawn a wobbly oval packed with green scribbles. "It's Daddy's hotel." She pointed to the oval. "And that's the fish pond like yours. Daddy says they're going to dig it real big." My hands went still on the filter housing. "What fish pond, honey?" "The one behind his hotel. He has a map in his office with all the lines. I traced some with my finger." She swept her hand in a wide arc. "The lines go way past the lake." I stared at the green oval on her drawing. The placement was precise, directly behind the resort's main building, right where my 40 acres sat. "Did you see this map recently?" "Yesterday. Mommy was upset because Daddy had to work late again. So I went to his office and he let me color while he talked on the phone." She leaned in, dropping her voice. "He said phase 2 a bunch of times. Phase 2. Petra chattered on about her drawing, but I had stopped taking it in. I was seeing Dylan's office the way she must have seen it. The architect's rendering on his wall, survey lines reaching across land he did not own, plans already drafted for property he intended to take, land he had tried to take through fraud. The fish pond Nadine and I had dug together in 1996, the clearing where we'd let her ashes go, the oak grove where Petra herself played on visits, all of it already folded into his expansion map, as if my signature on that forged amendment had been something he'd simply counted on. "Grandpa, you okay?" I realized I'd been gripping the pond filter hard enough for it to hurt. I set it down. "I'm fine, sweetheart. That's a beautiful drawing. Why don't you bring it inside and show it to Grandma's picture on the mantle? I think she'd love to see it." Sometimes silence carries more force than any accusation. After Petra skipped toward the house, I stood in my backyard and looked at the land Nadine and I had spent a life building. The fish pond caught the morning light, its surface moving gently in the breeze. From where I stood, I could make out the resort's roof line a quarter-mile off that monument to Dylan's ambition pushing up above the tree line. He had already laid plans for this land probably months ago, maybe longer. The forged amendment hadn't been a desperate move. It had been execution. Someone had drawn those survey lines, knowing exactly where they were headed, had calculated the square footage, had projected Phase 2 revenue from a plan that treated my refusal as nothing more than a temporary delay. I took out my phone and typed a message to Dylan. "Need to talk. Maple Street Diner tomorrow, 9 a.m., just us." His reply came 40 seconds later. "Okay, not, what's this about not? Is everything all right?" Just acknowledgement, as if he'd been expecting the call. I spent the rest of Saturday working out what to say, then understood by Sunday morning that words weren't really the point. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived at 8:50. I took the corner booth, the same one where I'd told Nadine I wanted to buy the 40 acres back in 1985, where she'd smiled and said, "Then let's build something that lasts." Dylan walked in at 9 on the dot, sweeping the room before he spotted me. He moved with the careful, measured calm of a man walking into a negotiation, his face pleasant and giving nothing away. "Morning, Dad." He settled into the seat across from me. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the photocopy Claudette had obtained from the county recorder's office, and slid it across the table. Dylan looked down. This was the moment I had been watching for. If he'd had no part in it, if Clifton Spurlock had acted alone, if Dylan truly knew nothing about the forged signature, he would have asked what he was looking at. His eyes would have moved across the document with real confusion before landing on the signature line, before seeing his own name typed below my forged handwriting. He didn't ask. His gaze went straight to the signature, held there for exactly 2 seconds, then came up to meet mine. No confusion, no question. Just the flat, composed stare of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at and understood precisely what it meant. The waitress appeared with coffee. "You folks ready to order?" "Not yet," I said, keeping my eyes on my son. She retreated. The coffee sat untouched between us. Dylan's jaw tightened, barely, almost nothing, but I caught it. He didn't reach for the document, didn't lift it to look more closely, didn't turn it over to check the back. His hands stayed flat on the table, and in that stillness I saw everything I had been working to avoid seeing for 3 weeks. He had known about the amendment. Maybe not every particular of Clifton Spurlock's execution. Maybe not the precise timing, but he had known. What moved across his eyes wasn't the shock of someone discovering a fraud. It was the calculation of a man assessing what my having this document actually meant. "Tell me," I said. The words came out softer than I'd meant them to, but they landed with weight in the air between us. Outside, a truck ground past on the street. Someone at the counter laughed at something. The whole ordinary world kept moving while I sat across from my son and waited for him to explain how we had ended up here. Dylan stared at the forged signature carrying my name, the name he shared, the legacy I had spent my life trying to leave him. And for the first time since he'd settled into that seat, something gave way in his careful composure. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Tell me," I said again. Dylan set the document down and spoke without raising his eyes. "You were never going to let go, Dad." I said nothing. The forged amendment lay between us on the table, my counterfeit signature visible from where I sat. "I needed that land," he went on, "for Phase 2, for the resort to have a real future. You knew that. Everyone knew that. But you wouldn't so much as discuss it." His voice held steady, measured, the tone of a man presenting a business case to a board of directors. "You would have sat on those documents forever. I just moved things along. Moved things along. As if forging my name was no different from expediting a routine permit. "Clifton said it would be clean," Dylan continued. "Get the amendment filed, get development started, and by the time you noticed, if you even noticed, the land would already be pulling revenue. You'd see the numbers and understand it made sense." I watched my son justify fraud by pointing to projected earnings. 2 booths away, the waitress topped off someone's coffee. A truck swung into the parking lot outside. The ordinary world kept right on running while Dylan sat there and explained how he had planned to take 40 acres from his own father. "You built something real with Colfax Freight," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "But that was yours. This is mine, the resort, the expansion, the whole vision. That's what I'm building, and I needed room to build it." The last part landed like a blade between my ribs. He wasn't asking forgiveness. He was distributing blame. In Dylan's accounting, my refusal to hand over land I had owned for 36 years had pushed him into fraud. I had made him do it by holding on. I let the silence stretch until it became something he had to sit in. Dylan shifted in his seat. His coffee sat cold and untouched. Finally, I leaned forward. "Did your mother teach you that, or did you figure it out yourself?" Dylan's face drained. His mouth came open and nothing followed. The question had found what it was looking for because we both knew the answer. Nadine would have been devastated. She had raised him to build things that endured, to do right by people, to earn what he claimed as his. Everything Dylan had just laid out on that table would have broken her heart. He looked away. A long moment passed with neither of us speaking. Then I stood, pulled 2 20s from my wallet, and set them on the table beside the cold cup. "When you've worked out what you actually want to say to me," I told him, "you know where I live." I walked out without looking back. Some confessions don't reach for forgiveness. They ask you to carry the blame alongside them. I spent Monday doing yard work replacing fence posts that didn't need replacing, cleaning gutters that were already clear, keeping my hands moving while my mind turned over the same question on a loop. What now? The forged amendment was a crime. Otto Fenwick had confirmed it. I could hand everything to law enforcement, file a civil suit, contact the State Real Estate Commission, and have Clifton Spurlock's license revoked. Or I could do nothing and watch my son raise his empire on a fraudulent foundation. I was out splitting firewood when my phone rang just past 7. Dylan's name on the screen. I set the axe down and answered. "Dad?" His voice sounded off flat and far away, as if he were calling from a great distance rather than 3 miles up the road. "I need to tell you something." I waited. I went home yesterday after the diner. Confronted Renee about the amendment, about Clifton Spurlock, about all of it. He stopped. I could hear him breathing. She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, just looked at me and said, "You built this, Dylan. I just helped you keep your hands clean." I walked to the porch and lowered myself onto the steps, phone pressed to my ear. Then she picked up her purse and walked out. Dylan went on. Didn't pack a bag, didn't say where she was headed. Just left. I thought maybe she'd cool off. That we'd talk. Another pause longer this time. But this morning I went into her home office to find her contacts, people I ought to call. And there was a suitcase behind her desk, already packed, clothes, toiletries, cash, everything. His voice dropped toward a whisper. She had a bag packed, Dad. Already packed. Before I said a single word to her about the amendment, she was ready to disappear the moment this came apart. The revelation landed with cold, quiet precision. Renee hadn't bolted in panic. She'd maintained an exit strategy all along, a prearranged escape for the moment her part in the forgery was exposed. The packed bag meant she had always understood this day might arrive and had prepared for it with the same deliberate efficiency she'd brought to the fraud itself. "How long has it been there?" I asked. "I don't know. Could be weeks, could be months. The clothes are summer weight. She must have packed it back in August, September." He let out a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. "All this time I thought we were building something together. The resort, the expansion, the whole future, and she had a bag ready in case she needed to run." I listened to my son breathing on the other end of the line. 41 years old, successful by every measure the world uses, and only now finding out that the person closest to him had been planning her exit since summer. "Have you spoken to Petra?" I asked. "She's at Daphne Beaumont's parents' place for the week. Thank God. I don't know what I'd tell her." "You tell her the truth," I said. "That people make mistakes sometimes, and sometimes those mistakes carry consequences." "Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm telling you what I would have told you 20 years ago if you'd thought to ask." A long silence. "Are you okay?" I asked at last. The question sat in the air between us. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak branches. Inside my chest, something twisted anger and grief braided together, and a deep, unwelcome understanding that my son had built everything on unstable ground and was only now feeling it give way. "I don't know, Dad," Dylan said quietly. "I don't know." It was the first time in 2 years he'd admitted to not knowing something. We stayed on the line a few seconds more, neither of us finding words. Then he hung up without a goodbye. I sat on the porch steps long after the call ended, holding the phone, listening to silence where the dial tone had been. My son had justified betraying me by blaming me for having built something worth taking, and his wife had walked out carrying a bag she'd packed before he ever said a word to her. Claudette spread 2 stacks of documents across her desk that morning and said, "Pick one." I'd driven to her Washington law office at 8:30 without calling ahead. She'd taken one look at my face and cleared her morning. She tapped the left stack. "This triggers loan acceleration. The forgery constitutes fraud. The confidentiality breach violates the NDA. Dylan's involvement creates a change of control issue. The bank calls the full $8 million immediately. The resort can't cover it. Total bankruptcy." Her hand moved to the right stack. "This is a controlled reset. Full rewrite of every agreement, complete transparency throughout. You keep absolute control of your land. Dylan runs the resort under clearly defined terms. The bank restructures with new covenants. Clifton Spurlock loses his license and faces criminal exposure, but Dylan gets a real chance to start over clean." She sat back and waited. I looked at both stacks. The left one was thicker motions, complaints, acceleration, notices, the language of demolition. The right was thinner but denser. New operating agreements, revised loan documents, transparency protocols. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'm your attorney, not your conscience," Claudette said. "But I've watched clients choose revenge over resolution for 30 years. The ones who burn everything down are convinced they'll feel better once the ashes settle. They never do." I thought about Colfax Freight. 35 years building a company on handshake deals and clean ledgers. 3 other freight operations in the region had folded while I was running mine. 2 went down from internal theft, 1 from a lawsuit that left everyone involved in ruins. I'd been to all 3 funerals. Sat in the back row, watched solid people get destroyed by battles nobody walked away from winning. "How much wreckage does it take to make a point, Claudette?" I said. "I didn't build Colfax Freight by burning things to the ground." She nodded. "Then you want the right stack." "I want my son to have a real chance to do better," I said. "But I want it completely clear he's running a business on my land under my terms. No forgery, no fraud, no hidden arrangements, full transparency, or I take it apart myself." Claudette made a note. "That's the controlled reset. I'll need a week to get everything finalized. We'll have to coordinate timing carefully." "Timing? You don't simply file these documents," she said. "You deploy them deliberately." She pulled up a calendar on her screen and angled it toward me. Renee scheduled a VIP investor opening for Monday, December 4th. Secondary press perspective expansion partners the full production. She put it together weeks ago before any of this came to light. I could see where she was heading. "You want to file this morning of the event?" 6 a.m., Claudette said. 4 actions at once. Formal notice to the bank triggering a change of control review. A freeze request to the county recorder on the fraudulent amendment. Withdrawal of your cooperation letter to Harlan Okafor. Formal notice to the Virginia ABC requesting an immediate review of the designated responsible party on the liquor license. She leaned forward. Dylan receives everything before the event gets underway. He'll have to decide in real time, cancel, postpone, or stand in front of investors and explain why his attorney just received 4 legal notices. It isn't vindictive, it's strategic. We're forcing complete transparency at the exact moment when concealing anything would be fatal. I thought about the day I'd walked away from Colfax Freight with a handshake and a clean ledger, nothing burning behind me. The buyer had been uneasy about the transition. I'd spent 2 weeks personally introducing him to every major account, vouching for him, making sure the handoff left no loose ends. That company was still running today, still profitable, still treating people right. Some fights you win by refusing to destroy the thing you're fighting over. Do it, I said. Claudette drew the right stack toward her and began sorting the documents into execution order. I watched her work precise, methodical, building the structure that would protect my land while giving Dylan a genuine opportunity to earn back what he'd tried to take. One more thing, I said. When this is finished, I want a meeting. Me, Dylan, you and whoever represents him face to face. The terms get laid out clearly. Agreed, Claudette said. After the December 4th filings, we'll set it up. Give Dylan a week to absorb it, then we build the new structure properly. I left her office at 10:30 and drove home. The next 6 days moved at a crawl. I worked the property, tended to things that needed tending, and waited. Monday morning, December 4th, I was up at 5:30. Made coffee, took it to the porch, and watched daylight come up over the 40 acres Nadine and I had bought in 1985. The December fog sat thick enough that I couldn't make out the fish pond, but I knew exactly where it was, 200 yards southeast, ringed by oak trees we'd planted the year we dug it. My phone buzzed at 6:03. One word. Sent. Timing isn't cruelty when the truth was always going to hurt. I sat there with my coffee, tracing the cascade Claudette had just set in motion. The bank's compliance officer opening an urgent message, the county recorder taking in a freeze request, Harlan Okafor's assistant routing a withdrawal of cooperation, the Virginia ABC receiving a formal review notice, 4 actions released at once. No warning, no room to negotiate, just the measured application of consequences Dylan had put in motion the moment he approved that forged signature. Renee had scheduled the VIP investor event for 10 a.m. That left Dylan 3 hours and 57 minutes to decide what he was going to tell them. I wasn't dismantling his resort. I was requiring him to run it honestly or not at all. The fog began to thin around 6:30, uncovering the oak grove, the pond, the clearing where we'd scattered Nadine's ashes. The land looked no different than it had the day before, but everything had shifted underneath it. The forged amendment would be frozen at the county recorder. The bank would begin examining whether Dylan's role constituted a material change requiring loan restructuring. The liquor license would come under scrutiny, and Dylan would have to account for all of it in front of investors who'd made the drive from Washington, D.C. and elsewhere expecting champagne and expansion news. Claudette's text still glowed on my screen, one word representing 4 legal actions deployed with surgical precision. I finished my coffee and went inside to wait for whatever came next. Dylan's phone buzzed at 9:47 Monday morning while he stood in the resort lobby shaking hands with VIP investors. I wasn't there, but Daphne Beaumont was. She told me everything the following day, each detail sharp in her memory, like she'd been holding it for someone who would actually understand what it meant. Dylan had been mid-sentence with a prospective expansion partner when his phone lit up. He glanced at it, excused himself, and slipped into the hallway. Through the glass doors, Daphne watched his posture shift, shoulders drawing in, one hand rising to his forehead. The call ran 90 seconds. When he came back inside, his face had lost its color. "Everything all right?" the investor asked. Dylan produced a smile. "Fine. Excuse me just a moment." He rejoined the group, shook more hands, made easy conversation about the resort's offerings. At 10:03, the phone went off again. This time, Dylan didn't try to hide his reaction. He looked at the screen and his jaw visibly tightened. Another exit to the hallway. Another 90-second call. When he came back, the smile was gone. Daphne had planted herself near the refreshment table with a clean line of sight to the entrance. Renee had brought her on in October to write a feature on the resort for a regional lifestyle publication, the kind of polished piece that made boutique hotels look like destinations rather than businesses. She'd been at the November 11th opening and filed a preliminary draft. The December 4th event was supposed to hand her the material for the expansion angle. Instead, she was watching Dylan Colfax come apart in real time. The third call came at 10:21. Dylan was standing in the center of the lobby when his phone rang. He answered without moving away this time, maybe because he'd already stopped keeping track of appearances. Daphne couldn't catch the caller's side, but she heard Dylan's. "Harlan." A pause. "No, wait. Just let me—" Another pause longer. Then his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Don't do this." Whatever Harlan said next caused Dylan to close his eyes. The call ended. Dylan stood frozen in the middle of his own lobby phone, still pressed to his ear, even after the line went dead, while 20 VIP guests studied the floor and the ceiling and pretended not to see. One of them was paying close attention, though. Daphne Beaumont had eyes on all 3 exits. She recorded the exact times in her notebook. She called me Tuesday afternoon at 2. I was out splitting firewood when my phone rang from a number I didn't know. "Mr. Colfax, this is Daphne Beaumont. I'm a journalist. I got your number from the county recorder's office. It's on the public filing for your property easement." I set the axe down and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What can I do for you, Miss Beaumont?" "I was at Blue Ridge Crest Resort yesterday for their VIP investor event. Your son mentioned back in November that you were getting on in years and preferred to stay home. But I watched him take 3 phone calls yesterday that looked like his world was caving in." I walked to the porch and sat on the steps. "I see. The first one came at 9:47 a.m., she said. Based on his reaction and the timing, I'd put money on it being his bank. The second was at 10:03. He looked more angry than scared that time. The third was at 10:21. Someone named Harlan. Dylan asked him not to do something, then just stood there after the line went dead." She paused, and I heard papers moving on her end. "I did some research this afternoon," Daphne said. "Found a filing at the county recorder dated December 4th concerning an amendment to your property easement. Found a notice to the Virginia Alcoholic Beverage Commission requesting review of the resort's designated responsible party. Found a withdrawal of cooperation letter sent to Harlan Okafor, the resort's general manager." I stayed quiet and let her go on. "Renee hired me in October to write a feature on the resort. She wanted the kind of story that makes a place look successful and inevitable. She handed me the whole narrative. Local entrepreneur builds his dream resort, honors his father's legacy, creates jobs, brings economic development to the region. She gave that a moment to breathe. But nowhere in the resort's promotional materials does your name appear, Mr. Colfax. The lobby, the press releases, the mission statement, nothing. The only trail I found led to the county records. 40 acres of prime lakefront with an easement that reads like someone went to considerable trouble to dress up something complicated in plain clothes. I turned it over in my mind, Dylan in that lobby absorbing 3 phone calls while his whole carefully assembled facade came apart in front of the investors he most wanted to impress. Renee booking that event weeks out before she had any reason to think her escape plan would ever see daylight. Claudette calibrating the filings to hit at 6 sharp, leaving Dylan 3 hours and 47 minutes to choose between coming clean and keeping up appearances. He'd kept up appearances, naturally. "Mr. Colfax," Daphne said, her voice dropping. "I don't believe I want to write the piece Renee commissioned. There's another story underneath it. How do you explain your son to a stranger when that son spent 6 months painting a false picture of you? What story is that?" I asked. "The one about who genuinely built this place." "Not the resort itself," she said. "I think I can see who built that. I mean, the ground it stands on, the land, the money, the name that convinced the bank to sign off in the first place." I cast my eyes toward the 40 acres Nadine and I had purchased in 1985, the oak grove holding her ashes, the fish pond the 2 of us had dug together in 1996, the clearing where Petra ran when she came to visit. Still mine, every acre of it held in place now by Claudette's precision and by Dylan's failure to take what he hadn't managed to steal. "If you're printing my words," I said, "they go in exactly as spoken. No filing down the edges, no presenting both sides as equivalent." "That's the only way I want it," Daphne said. I was on the front porch steps, phone pressed to my ear, watching December sun push through the bare oak limbs. Daphne waited on the other end without rushing me. "All right," I said finally. "I'll talk." When Dylan rang on Wednesday evening, his voice carried something I hadn't heard from him in a long time, a kind of emptiness scraped clean of the certainty he usually wore like a second skin. "Dad, I need to come by." A request, not a statement. I stood at the kitchen window studying the backyard where the fence rose dark against the December night. "Saturday," I said. "If that works." He hesitated. "If that works," I thought about the fence post I'd driven into the ground on November 10th while he was shaking hands at the resort opening. I thought about 18 months of doors quietly closed in my face. I thought about Nadine, who always held that asking beats assuming. "Saturday's fine," I said. He showed up at 9, dressed in jeans and a plain jacket. No suit, no silver cufflinks, none of the business presentation armor. We took our usual chairs at the kitchen table and sat without speaking for a stretch. "I'm not sure where to begin," he said. "Begin with April, the first meeting." And he did. He walked me through the whole of it the moment the equity negotiations began, the point when he handed Renee the paperwork and stopped watching closely the first time he saw the forged amendment and went quiet rather than confront it, because confronting it meant admitting the thing had slipped out of his hands. No deflection, no one else assigned the fault. He laid out the sequence the way a dispatcher reads a cargo manifest after something has gone missing. I heard him out without a word. When he stopped, the only sound was the kitchen clock. "I need you to refile everything," I said. "Accurate figures, clean documentation, nothing hidden." Dylan gave a single nod. "I know." After he drove away, I put the kettle on and settled at the table where Nadine used to sit grading papers in the lamplight red pen crossing pages while I went over Colfax freight invoices across from her. She used to say the punishing part of teaching wasn't marking the wrong answers. It was standing there while a student repeated the mistake you'd already walked them past. The formal refilings took place on Friday, December 15th at Claudette's Washington law office. Dylan worked through every signature while Claudette walked him through what each document did. Loan guarantee restructured a firm 5-year exit provision protecting my position. Liquor license corrected to reflect true ownership. Disclosure of fraudulent amendment officially nullified by the county recorder. Pastor Alton Reardon sat in as independent witness, a condition I had insisted on rooted in the trust principles Nadine had built our household around. When the final page was signed, Pastor Reardon laid a steady hand on Dylan's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "this is where it begins, not where it ends." Dylan looked at him and dipped his head, nothing more. Then his eyes found the ledger on the side table near Claudette. "Is that what I think it is?" I confirmed it. "Can I look through it?" I pushed it across to him. He took his time with it, turning each page with the deliberate care of someone who understands weight. 18 months compressed into columns, the shutout meetings, the CC lines with my name removed, the checks, no one acknowledged, all of it in the tight, even hand of a man who'd tracked freight manifests for 35 years. He came to the last page. November 10th, 2021. 4 words. He used to help. Dylan sat with that a long time. When he finally closed the ledger and placed it back on the table, he had nothing to offer. Some records exist not as weapons, but as proof that the thing was real. Monday morning, Daphne's feature ran in a Virginia business publication and rippled out across the hospitality trade. The headline, "The man behind the resort, Raymond Colfax, built more than a hotel." It sketched a 69-year-old father, a freight operator who'd built a fleet from scratch and still showed up in flannel, and a 2006 Ram 1500. The man whose signature anchored every founding document yet, whose face appeared nowhere at the November opening. Daphne had set the scandal aside entirely, trained her lens on what I was and what I'd built in the decades before the resort drew its first blueprint. After that morning, Blue Ridge Crest Resort would carry the image of the father Dylan had written out of his story. Dylan phoned that afternoon. "You've seen it?" he asked. "Yes." A beat of quiet. "What's your reaction?" I turned to the window, the fence holding its line in the pale winter sun. "Your mother would have been glad it was written," I said. Saturday morning, December 23rd, 7 a.m. I stepped into the backyard and stood before the fence, complete now in every detail. I dragged my palm along the board's plumb-tight level, nothing shoddy anywhere in it. 38 years as a father settled on me all at once. Nadine, who spent 29 years teaching high school English and never awarded a grade a student hadn't honestly earned. Building Colfax freight out of a single truck into a fleet of 80 before passing it on with a handshake, and nothing owed. These 40 acres. The fish pond Nadine and I broke ground on in 1996. The oak she put in the earth in 1999. The old fence Dylan and I had raised together when he was 14. What had been taken. What remained. A fence is wood and fasteners and nothing else until the day it tells someone where your ground ends. Build a thing the right way, and you can turn your back on it without a second thought. The hammer was where I'd left it on November 10th, 43 days back. I lifted it, held the weight of it, gave the fence one last look. Then I put the hammer down. Done. I went inside and set the coffee going. The maker hissed through its cycle, and the kitchen filled up with that smell that means morning has started. Beyond the window, the 40 acres disappeared into December fog. The fish pond was nowhere visible, but its location was as certain to me as my own name. The oak Nadine had planted held its ground quiet and solid in the gray light. The fence ran the property line in boards that sat true. The coffee was ready. I drew a cup and stood at the window as the fog slowly gave way. December 23rd, 2021. 7:15. 3 miles north, Dylan would be opening the resort under terms that left nothing concealed. Petra was coming for Christmas. The bank's payments would run on the revised schedule. Every document at the county recorder was accurate, executed correctly, honest in every line. I held my cup and let the morning light come through the branches. The fence stood straight. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. That means more than I can easily say. Looking back on all of it now, what strikes me isn't the money or the documents or even the legal machinery Claudette put in motion. What strikes me is how long I missed what was happening because I trusted the person doing it. That kind of blindness doesn't come from being foolish. It comes from loving someone. I believe God allows certain betrayals not to break us, but to show us where we'd quietly stopped paying attention, and to give us the chance to stand back up and do what's right, even when doing right is the harder road. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it's this. First, read everything you sign. Every page, every line, every paragraph buried at the back. Love is not a reason to skip the fine print, it is a reason to be more careful with it. Second, document quietly and consistently. A ledger kept in private is worth more in a courtroom and in your own conscience than an argument made in anger. Third, the goal is never destruction. The goal is honesty. If you can force the truth into the open and still leave room for the other person to rebuild, that is the better victory. Fourth, in father stories like this one, the hardest question is never legal. It's personal. You can protect what's yours and still leave a door open. Those two things are not opposites. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today, a father, a friend, someone carrying something heavy and not saying so. Leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you longest. And if you haven't already subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, there are more stories waiting. Thank you for listening, take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.